Well, I think I will go ahead and get started here this evening. It's 7:01, so I'd like to welcome you to Evening at Egan. My name's Kitty LaBounty, and I'm biology faculty at the Sitka campus of UAS, and I'm really pleased to be one of the hosts for this evening's talk. So even though this is a virtual meeting tonight, we're hosted from the UAS campus in Juneau. And all of our campuses in Juneau, Ketchikan, and Sitka reside in Tlingit territory. And specifically, our Auk Bay campus in Juneau is located on the land of the Akwaan people. And I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Akwaan and the greater Tlingit community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. So thank you. So tonight's speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Graham. She's an entomologist with the USDA Forest Service Forest Health Program, and it's a position she's held for the last 9 years, and she'll share more about the Forest Health Program in her talk. And I'm really thankful that Dr. Graham has agreed to share her expertise and passion for forest insects and their roles in forest ecology with us this evening. The title of her talk is Western Blackheaded Budworm, a tiny moth that orchestrates change in an old growth forest. So take it away, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Kitty, for inviting me. This was really great timing with this Western blackheaded budworm outbreak that we're experiencing right now. And so I'm really happy to be able to present to the community and to share what we know and a little bit of the history of this interesting little insect that we have in mass numbers right now. I am going to turn my camera off for the presentation because I don't have the greatest Wi-Fi here, and I do have a couple of videos that I want to share, so I don't want to have anything bog it down. So I'll turn it back on at the end for questions. So as I said, this talks about the Western black-headed budworm and a tiny moth that has been.
Elizabeth, we
Yep.
might have lost you a little bit there.
Can you hear me?
Now I can.
Okay, sorry, must have been turning my camera off. It disappeared for a second. Okay, well, we'll start again. So yeah, this is the Western black-headed budworm. And in case you don't see it on the screen, I put a little arrow there. They're very good at camouflaging and blending in, especially when they land on the bark of trees and stuff. But I'll go in a little bit more detail about the moths in a minute. As far as information about me, there I am. As Kitty said, I'm an entomologist, and I've been at the Forestry Sciences Lab, which is right next to the UAS campus, since 2012. And I've been part of the, it's called the Forest Health Protection Team, and that falls under what's called the State and Private Forestry branch of the Forest Service. So I'm not part of the P&W research station that houses most of the, that the lab mostly houses, but instead we're a separate division that gives us the authority to work on all land, state and private, not just the national forest. So our concern is about forest health in general, and insects and diseases don't tend to recognize property lines, and so we're not limited to just working within the national forest. And so our jobs take us all over looking at forest health. And so I do want to acknowledge a lot of this information is compiled from our forest health protection team. We're a very small group here in Alaska, but the mission of forest health protection is to protect and enhance forest health by providing landowners and managers with information and resources. And we do that through monitoring the extent and impacts of these damaging insects and diseases, as well as invasive plants. We provide timely surveys and monitoring information, as well as offering lots of technical and financial assistance. This is our website that we have here. You can navigate to that. It is just a wealth of information on different forest pests, forest activities, or forest health issues. We have old conditions reports on there, as well as information on current activity. We've also been trying to make more of a presence on social media just to share information in another way. You can follow us on with the hashtag Alaska Forest Health and with the Tongass and Chugach Facebook pages, as well as the Alaska Forest Service Twitter page. And we try to put as much information as we can in a timely manner.
Move on.
Oh, okay. So as far as forest health in Southeast Alaska, we are pretty fortunate here. There's not very many major disturbance agents that we have. You know, in a lot of other areas, we have things like bark beetle outbreaks and fire, and that's a big driving force for our forest changes. But here in Southeast Alaska, we're pretty fortunate. Some of the big landscape level disturbance events that we have include yellow cedar decline, abiotic things like flooding and landslides, or wind events like we're experiencing today. Some people may be surprised to hear that we do have spruce beetle in Southeast Alaska, but however, it just occurs here at really low levels. Typically, small amounts of damage occurs, and we have had outbreaks in the past, but they're usually pretty contained. But then the biggest, one of the biggest events that we can have as a disturbance agent are these defoliator events. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. This was my first glimpse at a defoliator outbreak, major defoliator outbreak, and that was back in 2012 when we had a little bit of hemlock sawfly feeding damage.
Hey, Elizabeth, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Were you advancing your slides?
I am. Are they not coming through?
No, they're not quite coming through.
Okay, let me try stopping my screen share and starting again. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay. You know what, I'll do it this way. And you see the slides now?
No, it looks like you need to click again, maybe.
Huh.
Unless it's me.
Okay, let me try this again.
I'm not seeing it either.
Okay.
Okay, sorry about that. We'll try this again. Any luck?
No. It's the words I can see are double click to enter full screen mode. This worked perfectly, of course, when we were practicing. We got it.
Is it? Oh, okay. I won't touch anything. Is it coming up now? Yep.
Yes.
Okay. And let me see if I click, is it going to go forward? Are they
Roger.
advancing? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I see main hemlock defoliators.
Okay. So we'll go back a second here. Sorry about that. So yeah, the defoliation events that we're going to talk about, when I say defoliation event, what I'm referring to is an insect outbreak so great that it causes damage across the landscape. So I don't want to give the impression that the couple insects that I'm talking about today are only defoliators. We have many, many, many different defoliators in the forest, but when it comes to these major defoliation events, we're talking about something that's at a landscape level. And these things happen when the populations rise to such levels that the natural controls don't keep them in check. And often they can be cyclical, or they'll be triggered by environmental conditions, or it could be a combination of the two. And our two main defoliators that we have here are the Hemlock Sawfly, which is here on the left, and the Western blackheaded budworm. which is here on the right. And what's significant about our two defoliators is they have two very distinct habitat feeding niches. And so the Hemlock Sawfly prefers to feed on the older foliage. They feed on the old needles and tend to leave the new growth alone. It's not the right nutrition for them. Whereas the Western black-headed budworm, as their name indicates, they start in the buds of hemlock. And then as the shoots elongate, they start feeding on those newer needles. And so one of the biggest concerns that we have is that if we have an outbreak of both Hemlock Sawfly and black-headed budworm at the same time in the same place, because that can result in complete defoliation. One question I get often from people is, what is a sawfly? Sawfly is a type, it's in the same order as the wasps and bees. So it's a type of wasp, except it's a different suborder. So they're called what's called a broad-waisted wasp. And they get their name sawfly because of the ovipositor, which is what the females use to lay their eggs. It is saw-shaped, and so that allows them to saw into a needle or a leaf, and they often lay their eggs inside. And so in the case of Hemlock Sawfly, the females actually lay their eggs inside the needles, and then they start as a needle miner and then hatch out and start feeding on the older needles. And they tend to feed in aggregates. So you have this big cluster group of sawfly larvae feeding together. And they, we call them wasteful feeders, and that they'll feed halfway through the needle and leave the rest of it behind. This is the male here with the, in the middle with the big fluffy antennae, and then the female was on the other side. They come in several color morphs. And so usually we see this bright green with the stripe running down the side, but they can vary from like a yellow beige to an orange color. Also, it kind of depends on when they've molted. So the other main one is the Western black-headed budworm. And as I said, they start in the buds and then they feed on the new growth as it comes out. And this is one of the adult moths here on the right. So with the Western black-headed budworm, eggs are laid on the needles and they're laid individually. So with the sawflies, we tend to see them feeding in big clusters, but the budworms will feed individually. After the caterpillars hatch, they hatch right about the same time as bud bursts with the hemlock. So they're tied very closely to the hemlock phenology. And then they will create these little shelters. So here on the top is a budworm caterpillar that's tied a shelter with those needles together. And they are able to feed in there. They can molt in there. They'll pupate in there as well. And so it's just a nice little protective place. But what it ends up doing is it creates this cluster at the end of dead needles, and that gives the tree a red kind of glowing appearance because of this damage right on the end. They do feed on other conifers. We will find them on Sitka spruce here, mountain hemlock, and if you have any ornamental firs or things like that, they will get on those too. But by far, Western hemlock is the preferred host. They do start feeding up in the crowns. And so quite often, before you actually see the caterpillars or the damage, what you'll start seeing and noticing is frass all around the understory plants. And so this is Devil's Club, which will hold itself kind of flat and is a great frass collecting plate for you. And so the frass will build up on the plants in the understory, and then the dry days it'll sound like it's raining, but it's just the caterpillar frass raining down. And then eventually, as the caterpillars start moving around and become more abundant, they do what I like to call hangling. And here's my video. Hopefully, it's going to come through here. But the caterpillars have this fun behavior, which you may have noticed out this summer, where they'll drop down and they, you know, maybe doing this to evade predation. It could be that they've eaten all their food and they're trying to find a new branch to land on, and they'll kind of get swung around. But they'll climb up and down on a piece of silk thread. And where this was at Lena Beach here in Juneau, and they were just, you know, very active. And then you can see the damage here in the middle from all that, the feeding, and then there's lots of frass sort of mixed in the middle there. And then that red glowing appearance. And, you know, for some people at first glance, this is gonna appear really worrisome and startling, thinking, you know, this tree must be dying. But then when you kind of get up closer, you'll see, hopefully, that it still has some of its older needles, in which case, you know, it should be okay. And then I just want to give an acknowledgement to Bob Armstrong, who I see is on the call today. These are some of Bob's awesome photos that he and I have run into each other budworm hunting more than once here in Juneau. And Bob has a great website, naturebob.com, and there's lots of great photos that he's captured. This one here on the right looks like a female laying an egg potentially. And but what this really captures here is just the amazing color morphs. There's a lot of variability in the moth patterns, and so they all have that kind of rectangular shape, but the color patterns can vary quite a bit. My favorite one is the one with this sort of stripe going down the side on the bottom left there. But they're pretty small moths. They're about you know, smaller than a penny. And the moths actually emerged, they probably started about late August, and we've been seeing them pretty active all throughout September. And I'd say probably this wind event might be enough to knock them down, but they've definitely been dwindling down the last week or so. So we've been recording these defoliation events in Southeast Alaska for, you know, since 1960s is when we started our aerial detection surveys, where we would fly small planes and record the damage, the amount of acreage from there. But however, prior to this, we have outbreaks even before that have been reported of Western black-headed budworm. And it goes all the way back to the early 1900s, 1917 and 1921. There was a widespread defoliation throughout Southeast, and it was most likely Western black-headed budworm. And then that started to ramp up again in the late 40s. And so the head of the Bureau of Entomology appointed the first ever entomologist to be stationed in Alaska for the Forest Service, and his name was William McCambridge. And so that's him here. And they had a story in the Alaska Empire, which my coworker went through and dig through the archives looking for information about the past outbreak in the 50s. And so they announced how McCambridge is here to study the budworm, and he jumped right in. There's lots of reports that he did and some really interesting studies that he looked at. And many of those you can find on our website. We've been trying to upload more and more of those. But one of my favorite reports came from 1952. So this was his first year in Juneau. And he said there were very heavy moth flights observed at several locations, Ketchikan, Hollis, Wrangell, Juneau, so on and so forth. Pilots for Alaska Coastal Airline and Ellis Airline Company stated that when flying between Juneau and Ketchikan at altitudes of about 2,000 feet, bugs would often hit their windshields in such numbers as to impair visibility. The insect remains found on the windshields proved to be budworm moths. This also was repeated in the area of the Rousseau Range. Moths were hitting there at 4,000 feet. And then personnel with the USGS reported making a count of 65 moths per square foot on the snowfield east of Juneau. So a lot of moths, heavy, heavy activity. This was also written up in the news in 1953. This was in July. War was declared on the insects rusting the Alaska evergreens. I like the term rusting. I think that's a good description. The trees definitely look pretty rusty after budworm attack. They refer to the worm as the villain, but then they sing praise because the regional forester gave McCambridge credit for perfecting his spray, which will kill the worm. And that spray is a emulsion 2% DDT. So this was further explored in the 60s, 1963, they did, which to my knowledge is the only application of aerial pesticides done on the Tongass, but this was a DDT spray. They did a very, very detailed report on testing different, using a float base, using a plane, using a helicopter, different sprays, lots of details, lots of information. There's some photos from the spray project. There's the helicopter on the float base. They basically said it is feasible to be able to do this. It can be done, but the question is, should it be done? So it was figured that they had to spray a rate of a 0.5 pound per acre. And they did say that it does kill budworms and sawflies. But McCambridge then later commented that there was concern that the amount of DDT that would eventually enter freshwater streams in the adjacent saltwater would be a drawback. We gave up the idea on budworm control. So fortunately, that was not pursued much further, and that was the only case of our DDT applications, to my knowledge, here on the Tongass. And the other thing that we realize is that these outbreaks, they have what we call a boom and bust. And so by the time that they had everything organized to do these massive spray projects, the outbreak had subsided. And so it's really not something that is necessary to be treating. So some other research that came out, temperature was looked at quite a bit for Western black-headed budworm, and whether or not that's a factor with the populations and how they build and when they build up. There's some indication that outbreaks have had warmer and drier than average summers prior to it. But then alternatively, another study showed that if the month of July, when the caterpillars are developing, is over 75 degrees, that can slow down development. If it's too cold, it can slow down development. So it's sort of a Goldilocks situation where if it's too hot or too cold, they don't do well. So not quite sure exactly the correlation, but temperature does seem to play a role. They're identified several parasites and predators, as well as viral and fungal diseases. And that seems to be the main thing that keeps these populations in check, is once they build up to these large levels, disease will take over, and that will knock the population back down for a while. And then they did look at some of the volume loss from this outbreak in the 50s. And there were some areas where it could have been a third of the net volume in Hemlock in some of the heaviest hit areas. Damage was always worse in stands that were mature with more than 50% Western Hemlock, which makes sense because that's their preferred host. So if you have a heavy Hemlock stand, you're going to have heavier host availability. And top kill was very common, especially where Hemlock is dominant. However, they did find that in most cases, the trees that had top kill did end up supporting a new late leader several years later. And lastly, they tested DDT and said that and other large-scale treatments could be effective against sawflies and budworm, but they are not worth the environmental impact. So that was here back in the 1955, that outbreak basically ended. And then we saw about, not much activity, little blips here or there, but then a big surge again here in the 90s. And that one kind of blew up again really quickly. There was a little bit in 1992, 93 over almost 300,000 acres, and then 94 still almost about 200,000, and then 95 there was very little activity. And that year they had suggested that it was because of the cold July that the caterpillar development was slowed. So then again, we didn't see much activity for another 30 years. And here we are now in our current outbreak state. And what we're seeing now looks, worse compared to anything else we've been recording since the 60s, but it does sound very similar to this outbreak that we had in the 50s. So it started with Hemlock Sawfly. This was in 2018. We had people reporting from Killisnoo Island, which is just off of Admiralty Island near Angoon. And the couple that had a private cabin there said they noticed the trees were browning, and they brought in a bag full of frass and said, what's going on? So we went out there and identified Hemlock Sawfly as the causal agent. And this was really crucial information. We had actually just completed our aerial survey a week prior, or 2 weeks prior to that, and had not recorded very much activity because the damage hadn't expressed itself yet. The Sawfly larvae hadn't really had a chance to feed as much, and so we had kind of missed that damage. And so thanks to the people from Killisnoo for bringing this to our attention, we were able to do a follow-up survey, and so we were able to track a little bit of that in 2018, and we found that there was a large amount, about 50,000 acres of damage we recorded, most of which was on Admiralty, Mitkoff, and Kupernoff Islands. We have a map here. There was a little bit on Prince of Wales as well. We were pretty limited in what we flew there, but we were able to capture that outbreak as it started in 2018. And then that got us organized, so we were able to do ground surveys in 2019. And the way we survey for the defoliators is we use what's called the beating sheet method. This was our seasonal technician, Isaac Davis, using the beating sheet. And so you hang that white sheet underneath branches and whack on the branches, and then you count what falls out. And so because we were able to do a pretty extensive survey in 2019, what we show here, this is just all the plots are merged for each island area here. And so on the x-axis, you have the island, and then the percent of trees with either sawflies or western black-headed budworm. And what this shows is it was almost entirely sawfly everywhere we went. Some in Mitkoff Island, it was almost every tree had a sawfly on it, and very few western black-headed budworm. The exception was Baranoff, which was the Sitka Ranger District, where we actually had very little sawfly damage. We didn't map much sawfly either, but we actually did have a decent number of budworm. Not enough to raise alarm, but it was interesting to see that there. And then this, for people here in Juneau, is probably pretty familiar site. This is the Jensen Olsen Arboretum. This picture, Merrill took. He was the former caretaker. He just recently retired, but he took this picture in May of 2019. And if you fast forward to July, this is that same spot, and you can see this tree here has just been hammered by Hemlock Sawfly. And if you go to the Arboretum now in that area, you'll see there's still quite a bit of damage and top kill and quite a bit of damage in that stand. From the air, the trees look very browned. They still have their new growth on the ends, but they don't have the inner crown. So when we conducted our aerial survey in 2019, we recorded over 380,000 acres of Hemlock Sawfly damage. This is our aerial survey program manager, Karen Hutton. And she's using our tablet as we fly about 1,000 feet, looking for the damage and mapping it as we go. One thing I'm not going to get into today, but if you're interested, definitely reach out. Karen did an awesome job at using satellite imagery to try to estimate the full extent of this outbreak, because we're not able to fly wall to wall doing aerial survey. And because of that, or with Karen's work doing the remote sensing, she estimated that that acreage of damage is actually probably double that, 380,000 acres. So 2020, we were pretty limited in what we could do, like everyone else. We did not fly aerial surveys, but we did get some high resolution imagery and recorded some damage that way using the imagery basically in the comfort of our homes. But it was very small. Most of it was on Prince of Wales Island. And we did record over 100,000 acres of defoliation. And as well, we recorded some mortality that we saw from that outbreak. 2020 was also very cold and wet. One thing I forgot to mention, one of the drivers of the Hemlock Sawfly outbreak is likely the dry conditions that we had in 2018 and 2019. Their population is typically controlled by a fungus. And so the fungus was limited by the dry conditions, and that helped trigger the Sawfly outbreak. But we did have people out surveying on the ground in 2020, and we saw a huge decrease in the amount of Sawfly larvae, and not too many budworms in our plots. However, we were getting some reports from the public about caterpillars hangling, especially around the Petersburg area and Metcalf Island. So 2021, we got back to a little bit more normalcy. We were able to do some more ground surveys, just not as extensive. But before we even got out, we started getting reports of large amounts of frass and the caterpillars hanging from trees and red trees. So we went out and conducted our surveys, and once again, we found Western blackheaded budworm was the dominant one, sort of the inverse of what we found the years before, where we found very little Hemlock Sawfly and lots of Western blackheaded budworm damage. And then this is a footage from our aerial survey. And you can kind of just see it's pretty dramatic, and I say it is very impressive because, just week prior to this, it didn't look anything like this. Oh. And then we also went over some areas where, we think this is mortality that's related to that Sawfly defoliation and, just really heavy damage. This is on the right here, this is Kilsnoo Island, where we continue to get reports of the budworm feeding, and along with several other defoliators. There's some biometrids, which are the inchworms, the loopers, have also been active there. And thanks to our reports from the people who live there, we've been kind of able to learn more about that. It's sort of been our canary in the coal mine. It seems like everything has been starting in that area, and then it extends further out. So hopefully we're not going to see any more defoliators come out of Kilsnoo. So in our aerial detection surveys for 2021, we recorded over 500,000 acres of defoliation. And in some places, that was where more than 50% of the leaves were defoliated. Along with that, we also recorded about 200,000 acres of top kill related to the Hemlock Sawfly outbreak years before, and 100,000 acres of mortality related to that outbreak. So that's a lot. That's a significant amount of damage and defoliation that's happening throughout the area. And so what are some of the impacts? What does this mean? And one thing that I forgot to emphasize early on is that both of these insects are endemic to the forest. They're not an invasive They're a natural part of the forest, and they play a role in the forest, as dramatic as they can be. They're one of the driving factors that create change. And so what are those impacts? Well, the negative is the decrease in growth. Trees aren't going to grow very well when they don't have any needles, any foliage. Top kill, that's, obviously that's not good for the tree, and definitely not mortality. But on the positive note, this opens up the canopy for the understory plants. There's a lot more light that's going to hit the forest floor thanks to these canopies. They can provide an abundant food source. I have yet to see the birds go crazy for them, and I was kind of surprised by that. But literature shows that they can be an abundant food source for small mammals and birds. And it's also a nutrient pulse. All of that frass that is, falling down to the forest floor, and those half-consumed needles, those are being recycled back into the floor, into the soils. And what we found with previous outbreaks is that there's an initial reduction in growth, but then as those nutrients end up getting back into the soil, the tree's able to take it back up, and it actually has an increase in growth years later because it's able to make up for it. And then just the words from one of my predecessor, John Hard, who did a review of the outbreak from the 1950s, and I thought he very eloquently put this in his Journal of Forestry publication. He says, the budworm is not an intruder to Alaska's virgin forest ecosystem, but a natural and perhaps beneficial component. Defoliation may cause dead trees and unsightly stands for a few years, but the energy and nutrients stored in the host needles are released during the rapid recycling process of an outbreak for use by surviving trees and other plants and animals. Increased solar radiation and precipitation reach the understory and soil surface until the crown canopy closes again. Therefore, large-scale defoliation and virgin stands should not necessarily be viewed with alarm, since stands have recovered from past epidemics. And so that does give a little bit of hope. When we look outside and realize, many of these trees are hundreds and hundreds of years old, and they've been through this several times before. So hopefully they can withstand this one too. So the summary, we have defoliator events that take place in Southeast Alaska every 30 to 40 years. And that's one of our main drivers of change. We don't have fire, we don't have bark beetles. I mean, we have bark beetles, but we don't have outbreaks. And so really this defoliator event is one of the major factors of disturbance that we have. However, a healthy forest is resilient and can withstand these events, but just keep in mind that it's not going to look exactly the same. The current Western blackheaded budworm outbreak will likely continue until the next year. Everything indicates it's still going to be going strong. Usually these outbreaks will last 2 to 4 years before crashing. And the recovery after a defoliator event can take several years. So it's easy for me to say these things, but this is a spot on the John Muir Trail here in Juneau. This is that, if people are familiar, it's right where that first bridge is. And this is an area that's been hit really hard with Hemlock Sawfly, and now Western blackheaded budworm. And I'll be watching this spot and see, how well it recovers. But, when I look at this, I think, oh, wow, that looks really bad. But I'm hoping I'll be back here, say, in 5 years, and I'll be showing an after picture, and hopefully it looks lush and green again. So with that, I will leave it here for questions, and I can try to turn my camera back on and see if there's any questions from anyone.
Thanks, Elizabeth. If you have questions, you can either put them in the chat or you can unmute and speak away.
One thing I did forget to add is our team has, as I mentioned, we've really been relying on the public and crowdsourcing our forest health observations. And one of the tools we've been using is the iNaturalist app. And so for folks who don't already use it, it's just been really a great tool for us because you can upload pictures of, you know, different insects and things that you see while you're out. And if it's something that's of interest to our group, we have it pulled into our forest health project. And so we really encourage folks to post to iNaturalist and definitely reach out if there's things that you're seeing that you're concerned about.
Hi, I'm Carla Hart, and I reached out to you this summer, I think, from doing a cross-admiralty trip a couple of times and seeing what I saw as devastation and the snowing of great quantities of frack onto our tents and boats and everything else. I really appreciate how you presented this to give some context, because I was feeling really fretful at the whole red mountains of Admiralty Island, and now I'm sort of curious to see how it does for the berry bushes.
Yeah, and you know, and I'm right with you. I'm saying these things, but I have some, you know, I get nervous myself when I fly over some of this, and I know there's definitely going to be trees that die. You know, that's inevitable, but hopefully, you know, that's not going to be the norm. And you know, it does give some comfort to look back at some of those old photos and look at that context and know that, you know, okay, this happened before, you know, we can get through it again.
There are a couple of questions in the chat, and I guess I'll start reading them. I'm curious if you have any sense of possible differences in impact in old growth versus young second growth stands.
Yeah, so some of the studies before, there was more concern in the older stands because it was, you know, there was more hemlock dominant, whereas in some of the younger stands they tend to be a little bit more spruce dominant. Ultimately, it's going to come down to stand composition more than age, because the budworms don't necessarily care about the age or the size of the tree, except for the fact that they tend to start higher up in the canopy, you know. So if you've got an old growth with a second growth underneath it, it's gonna, you know, be more prevalent up there. Yeah, so I think that it's really more a factor of the stand makeup than it is so much the stand age.
And then sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I just saw the next question was for
okay,
predictions for next summer. Yeah, and you know, my predictions right now is that we're going to have continued defoliation next summer. I think this outbreak will continue. You know, that one in the 90s ended really abruptly, and their best predictor was that it was just so cold and wet that they really never got going. And so, you know, it's possible we could have a bad, you know, weather-wise next summer that would slow them down. There is some reports that heavy snow years can help reduce populations because they lay their eggs on the needles. And so the snow can actually help rip off eggs. I don't think that would be enough to limit with the number of moths we've been seeing here. So I think it'll continue into next year, and then it's hard to predict any further out than that, though.
Go ahead, Tanya.
Hi, Lynn.
Hi, Tanya.
We enjoyed your presentation very much, and are wondering, what is frass?
Oh, yeah. Well, frass is a really polite way to say poop. And that's how, you know, entomologists like to make up new words so that it doesn't sound so bad. Frass is much politer.
Good. That's great. I never knew that. Thank you so much. And we love your little graphic of the worm on the toilet, by the way.
Now it explains what that means.
Well, I'd say that the forest around my house is very well fertilized. There was grass was like covering every surface. It was pretty impressive.
Yeah, it doesn't
and
make you feel
disgusting.
good when you realize that that's what you're shaking out of your hair.
No, that was pretty gross. Yeah, are there any more questions? Oh, one thing, do you mind moving back to, I think it was probably your second slide that had the website on it?
Oh,
Because I
yeah.
don't think we saw that one.
Okay, let me go all the way back.
Do I just talk?
I can,
Which
yeah,
one?
a second here. Ah, now I lost it.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
It's okay.
But yeah, if you can't find us, Googling Alaska Forest Health is a great way. And here I will.
So raise your hand.
Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering a couple things. One, what about all the birds? It seemed like I saw a whole lot more birds than I usually see this fall, was one thing. And the other thing, I run a tree removal service, and I'd like to not have to cut trees down. How do I know when that they're really dead or not, or whether they're going to come back or not? You got anything on that?
Well, a lot of these look really bad now, but we got to wait until the spring and see how well they leaf out. And then just looking to see if there's any living tissue, if you can kind of pull back, peel a little bit and see how that looks, that's a good indicator. But yeah, if they've got any foliage left, it's pretty amazing how well they can hold on, even if it's just a little bit. As far as the birds, I'm sad to say that I'm not much of a bird person, and so that wouldn't be a good question for me to answer. I've had this conversation with a couple people where we would have expected them to be going crazy this summer when there were so many caterpillars and they were all hanging from the trees. It seems like it would have been a feeding feast, but I never really saw that behavior. So I've been wanting to talk to more bird people to find out, if they were having fun feeding on them. I do have a picture of a warbler eating a hemlock sawfly, but otherwise, yeah, I don't have much info on that. I'm sorry.
Do you see the next one there, Elizabeth, in the chat?
No, sorry, I missed that.
All good.
So it says, is it safe to assume that the frassified needles are more readily recycled than the regular needles? Yeah, so that is, it's going to be more available. It's going to be recycled faster because it's already been partially broken down. Yeah, and hopefully I reassured you somewhat that this was not the budworm apocalypse. Yeah. Hopefully we don't have moths interfering with flights or anything like that. So we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you for including that historical information. That was kind of impressive that they were that thick.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I've been trying to encourage people to take me up to the ice field so we can repeat the 65 moths per square foot, but it hasn't happened yet.
Oh, well, hopefully you'll get up there. Well, last call for questions. Yeah, well, thanks so much. I'm not seeing any. I really appreciate you being willing to give this talk, and I hope sometime we get to see you in Sitka in person again. No doubt folks in Juneau get to see you, but we would love to have you back here and looking at our trees and telling us in person about these forest insects. Thanks again.
Thank you. And I really appreciate you guys having me. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions or talk to folks more if they want to reach out anytime. Thanks.
Oh, I see. He did see moths chasing insects. I wondered if anyone had really monitored like clutch size, or a number of clutches of
Yeah.
certain birds. I know I have song sparrows here in the garden that probably had 3 clutches this year, but I don't know for sure that, is that one more, is that more? They're keen into, they catch moths on my porch with my bug light, so they're very well fed.
Well, I also have heard reports of them just dropping into the rivers and the water. So yeah, I mean, plenty of things are eaten up. Yeah, birds were chasing them. Yeah, they're not very good flyers either. So I imagine they'd be an easy catch.
We definitely caught a few. Oh.
Okay, well,
Well-
everyone have a good Friday, and hopefully the wind calms down soon.
Yeah. Thanks again, and good night, everyone, and thanks for attending.
Thank you.